Hello humans, welcome back to this video series. It's been a while, well obviously it depends if you've been waiting for this or not, but whatever. So we're going to be talking about the pipeline, and we're going to be starting to transfer our assets into Painter. Now so far we have a worm with some animations, but I was initially planning to maybe create the logic of the game in Unreal and then, paint the stuff with all the textures, etc. But it occurred to me that it's much better, since we started with Maya, it's much better to finish and go through all of the pipeline so that you see the process as it is. Although for much bigger projects, obviously you would want to start with a basic model and some basic animations and then create your gameplay to prototype, or buy some basic assets just to prototype and then replace them with your own. But in this case, imagine if this is what basically be happening if you had a team, right? You probably have something basic in most cases, but since we have a very simple game, we can afford to go the full route and just create the, not only the assets with the animations for the final version, but also the textures, which obviously you can change at any time anyway. But it's nice to go through the pipeline as it is. This requires two things. First of all, we need to talk about the pipeline that we've set up. How will Painter work with the pipeline? And of course, we need to talk about quite a few things actually when it comes to physically based rendering. There's a couple of rules here and there. What are maps, right? What's a normal map, etc. How do these maps perform? RGB channels, what is luminance levels, right? So there's plenty of stuff to go through. But since the guys from Algorithmic, this is the company that obviously produces Painter, or Substance more accurately, I recommend you check their YouTube channel, and more importantly their documentation, because believe it or not, Wes does a really good job at explaining everything. Look, he's like the tutorial series on their website, in their like help and learning, whatever, Substance Academy, whatever it's called. The amount of like useful stuff and very well presented tutorials, much better than I am capable of presenting, simply because, well, I'm doing this on the fly. But Wes not only is actually much more experienced than I am, but he also has a much more much more dedicated resources to that, and obviously it's part of the algorithm thing, so it's much better presented and most likely better understood. Not to mention, by the way, that Algorithmic is incredibly active with the community, so chances are if you ask something in the comments, Wes will answer it. Okay, it could be some idiotic stuff, but he will answer it. Not to mention that a lot of their employees and developers, they answer stuff on the forums. It is unbelievable the amount of community engagement these people have, and it's just props and kudos to them. So I highly recommend you go on to Algorithmic's website, and if you're going to download the trial, maybe ask a couple of questions here and there. I've definitely done my fair share of asking, and probably if you watch the video tutorials that Wes did, in Painter 1, or older versions, and my comments are still there, the nearest comment, because most people that watch these tutorials are self-taught, just like myself. In my time, I didn't have the luxury of having someone go through the whole process, and this is why I'm creating this video series, because I'm hoping that if you're an aspiring game developer, I may make your life a little bit easier in that regard. Anyway, enough chatter. So if you got something that you don't understand, or maybe I'm not explaining everything very much in depth, and I probably won't, by the way, talk about both of these software packages, I recommend you check out the Algorithmic website, because unlike Maya, which has a pretty decent documentation, Algorithmic is top notch. Okay, this out of all three software packages, Maya, Mudbox, Unreal, right? Even like the Algorithmic has the best. So I recommend highly that you go there and check anything out that you basically can't understand from me, or just can't find, or maybe I just completely outright forgot to mention. All right. Okay, so that being said, let's go into our little diagram here. I've created a little diagram so we can talk about the pipeline a little bit more in depth. Now, I've color-coded these for a reason. So first of all, let's just talk about what we currently have. Now, I don't have the document from the previous, from the full pipeline, the one I outlined when we started this video series. But you know, we just passed this bit over here, so there's really no need to recreate, you know, the design document, the designing stage, the block out stage, etc. So all these things, the you know the concept art stuff, this stuff is pointless, and I'm definitely not gonna break out the Maya stages because that is like a lot of breaking out, right? You gotta create, you gotta animate, you know, UV map, this and that. So we're not gonna go over this. I just want to go over have a high level of understanding of what exactly we're about to do here. Now, first and foremost, what is substance? Well, you see, substance in Painter, I'm just gonna go ahead and actually, I don't know, maybe use a diamond. Perhaps not the best. Maybe something like this. I don't know. I just send it to the back. This is essentially a full software package, okay? This is even though these are two distinct programs, they both work with the same file type. So Substance is the file type of Algorithmic's Painter. I'm just gonna make this something like, I don't know, gradient black. Right, so this is Substance, okay? This was a really poor choice of geometry here, but look, you get the point, all right? This was really bad. It looks like shit. Look, this is annoying me. I'm just gonna go for the standard square, okay? And I'm gonna go ahead and just make this bigger, and I'm gonna put this over here like this, and send it to back. Much better. There we go. So this is Substance. Okay, this is starting to annoy me. All right, this is much. Come on, where's my center? There it is. There it is. All right, I got it. Okay, let's continue. Moving on. Now, Substance is essentially a combination of voodoo magic, procedural generation, and packaging software, code and techniques. But essentially, what happens is you get something from Maya. So we grab something off of Maya, and we're going to stick it either into Painter or Designer. Now, in general, it is entirely possible to stick them into both. So whatever it is I outputted, maybe I should have just gone like this. Well, no, not really. We're going to output an FBX anyway, so it doesn't matter. So this takes both of these programs can take the exact same input, okay? And they work in the exact same way when it comes to baking. So the baker, and I guess I have to explain what a baker is, but essentially a baker is a sub-software thing, like a sub-program which unites both of these. They share the same baker. Basically, it creates texture files, right? PNG files. We're going to use, by the way, all texture files are not JPEGs, but PNGs, for the sole reason that PNGs support alpha and alpha channel, and alpha channels obviously are important if you want to support any kind of transparency, you know, and they are, as far as I remember, higher bits, and there's really not as much, like, they have a decent compression ratio, but you know, look, PNGs, just use PNGs. Now, that being said, what's the difference between Painter and Designer? Now, Designer can output, imagine if like Designer is basically your broad strokes type of software. Let's say you have a barrel. Now, in Designer, it is easy, like you would use Designer if you wanted to create a barrel that would be procedure, like the color scheme of the barrel would be procedurally generated, right? So if you wanted to add some rust, if you wanted to add some I don't know, some grime, some scratches, maybe some paint damage, stuff that is basically should be done by random, you would use Designer, okay? Reason being is that Designer is a procedural piece of software entirely built. So you don't have to have any skills. By the way, obviously Photoshop skills will be advantageous, to say the least, when it comes to Painter and Designer, because you have to still understand, you know, concepts such as color channels, you know, how to create gradients, you know, blending modes especially are fairly important. So if you're good to go with Photoshop, you will be fairly at home when it comes to Painter and Designer. If you're not, we're gonna go over channels and, you know, textures, etc. when we actually get into Painter and Designer and start working with them. Now, in my video series will not be going over Designer because of the reason that I'm about to explain. Now, Designer can output a substance, okay, a substance. And this substance, or it can output a PNG file. So you could work with Designer entirely, all right? Now this substance, perhaps I should have used a more straightforward thingy. There we go. Now, this substance is able to be, okay, I'm going to talk later about this. So this substance, you can put it into Painter, right? Now, Painter can use this. What is Painter? Well, it's exactly what the name implies. It allows you to paint stuff on top of your 3D model, all right? Whatever you paint onto the 3D model will be transferred onto the UV, based on the UVs, into a color map, which would then obviously be compiled into a texture. Painter allows you to paint quite a lot of stuff. Not only, like, when I say paint, I don't mean only color-wise, all right? You can paint basically everything that's possible to paint under the sun. You could use a spray can, and I'm not talking about the spray in paint, as in Microsoft Paint. I'm not talking about that spray, right? I'm talking about an actual physical type of spray where you have a control over how heavy the particles are, how much gravitation affects these particles, if there's wind, right, and how much the paint will drip down once you spray paint on top, and it will reflect itself on top of, let's say, a normal map, which essentially defines where the edges are of a particular mesh, so that it will basically simulate much more detail, where it would be definitely very difficult to recreate this in a hand environment. Okay, so Painter is a very powerful tool, not only because it allows you to paint stuff like like grass blades or scratches or whatever, but it also has its own set of generators and masks and all sorts of fancy tools that allow you to really customize and hand paint your stuff. So that is not to say, for example, these two pieces of software can work both with the substance and the whatever it is you're painting into in Painter. You can send to Designer, and then you can send anything from Designer back into Painter, and these things are automatically obviously updated. So whatever it is you're sending, I should probably send this to the front and send this to the front. So whatever it is you're painting in Painter, you can send it to Designer to maybe adjust or create some extra random stuff, and then from Designer you can send it back to Painter, or maybe you could create a substance in Designer and paint with that substance over a mask in Painter, and then you decide to change the substance and by Designer, and whenever you do that, it will be automatically updated in Painter. Now, the most important bit here is the fact that Painter cannot output substances. Reason being is that substances are essentially materials, and they're compiled, so you need a compiler to do that, and that's what Designer does essentially. Not only that, but Designer allows you to dig into a substance and essentially code your own shaders, right? A designer is basically a shader creator, but instead of being a simple shader where it just says, right, this is where you're going to have rust and this is going to have this, it actually has its own internal, some kind of voodoo generation. I'm not entirely sure how they made it, but it's very fancy because you can regenerate stuff on the fly. So you could expose something. Imagine if this was a substance of a metal, right? Any metal. Let's say this is a substance. Let's say we get something like a barrel and we put it in Designer. Now in Designer, we decide, right, we're going to create a substance called a metal, and this metal will be steel. However, the steel will be, sort of rusty, etc., but we don't want it to always be the same amount of rust, right? You want some barrels to be rustier than others, some barrels to be pristine, some barrels to be red. So in the days past, and possibly in some workflows still, you would have to create several different versions of the same barrel, like a rusty barrel, a pristine barrel, I don't know, a damaged barrel, this barrel, this barrel. So you got all these, like, you got 15 different barrels, which is essentially the same thing. You got to do the same process 15 times, which is just a huge waste of your time. Designer bypasses this by allowing you to expose parameters, and actually most materials do that as well. The difference between Designer and a material is the fact that Designer can generate actual texture files based off the substance. Okay, so a material basically takes any inputs that you give it, like a texture, and whatever these inputs are, it maps them according to the UV coordinates, and you're left with whatever it is you got in the material. Now you can expose a parameter in this material, like for example, if you had water, which water is always a very complex material, and I'm not really well versed with water. I usually just use whatever the guys from Epic have created, because frankly it's just too much of a waste of time for a low budget game, for a low tier game. So there's no need to go ham with water and try to, Assassin's Creed or Crisis levels of water. Anyway, I'm going on a tangent here. What I wanted to explain is the fact that whenever you have a material, you got a particular set of parameters that are exposed in that material, should you so desire. For example, you've had a texture and you wanted to repeat this texture several times, which is most of the case what you're going to be doing anyway, depending on the size of the texture. You create a parameter which, well, basically multiplies the UV coordinates of the texture, meaning that once you spam it over a couple of times, you're gonna tile the texture in. Obviously, you want to have that as a parameter, so you could adjust that at runtime or during level creation. Therefore, this kind of parameter is efficient, but it does not in any way really change the texture itself. It just changes the final result, which you feed into the material. Okay. So you can get away with a 2x2 texture, for example, and just tile it thousands of times. Obviously, it will be very noticeable by the player due to the fact that, it's a 2x2, right? Everybody will see the pattern. But once you have something respectable like a 2K texture, or even a 4K texture, or even an 8K texture, or if you really go ham, you can go to 16K texture, which I don't think is supported yet by most, but by Substance or by Unreal. But I don't know when you're watching this, but obviously whenever you're watching this, multiplied by 2 if you want to go higher or whatever. Obviously, there's a point where the definition that you gain is simply lost, because it will require bigger and bigger and bigger monitors, and resolution just eventually stops producing more fidelity and just starts clogging the system. So let's just say I decide to put this, instead of a 2x2, have it at 4K, and then I decide to tile it. Now, if I only had 1K texture, I would have to tile it 4 times to achieve the same amount of not only definition, well, let's not say definition, because imagine that I'm not going to scale it. So if I had a 4K, it would be this big, right? It will be this big. That would be a 4K. But instead, I only got a 1K, which means that I have to tile it 4 times just to cover the same area, and it will be very noticeable. Now, if this was a 4K texture, I could get away with just covering all of this with one simple texture, and if I need to tile it, I can actually tile it much more, and the player will not actually see notice that much of a difference. For example, in other games, in most games, in all games almost, the ground is tiled, right? So if you look at it from an eagle-eyed perspective, you will immediately notice the pattern. But because you're on the ground level as a player, you're not really going to notice the tiling unless you really try to really zoom into it and you just really pay attention to it. You're never going to notice the fact that things are close enough. You will see repeating textures. You will see, for example, the same crack on the dirt in the road, for example, right? You're walking along a dirty road, or you see like a rock or something, and you see the same crack on every other rock, or every other step you take on the road. But you're never really gonna see crack next to a crack next to a crack, because the tiling is big enough and it's spread out enough that you don't have that problem. Obviously, it depends on the type of texture that you tile. Usually, you want seamless tiling, and you want fairly identical stuff. When we're talking about a brick wall, for example, right? Something like this, right? This would be a texture number 1, and this would have like 20 bricks, and the wall would be this size, and you would just use this grid wall. You just tile this 1, 2, 3, 4 times, however many times you'll tile it, and you will generate this brick wall. The idea is that because the texture is seamless, meaning that if you take this, like this left side is identical to the right side and the top side is identical to the bottom side, means that if you put it next to one another, they will not have a difference over here. They will basically combine. They will basically create a cohesive picture once they combine. So that is tiling. Now, I didn't realize I went on this long topic, but back into the question at hand here. So once you have your little texture here by designer created, you can input it directly into Unreal, and Unreal will happily accept it. You can chug it into a material, and like I already said, you can have your little parameters there. Have some control over the texture, such as tiling, or maybe you want to make it more transparent, less transparent, especially during runtime. Entirely possible during materials, which we will take a look in Unreal anyway. But Designer is a little bit different because not only allows you to have these parameters, but because you have, let's say, use our example from before, if you wanted to create an iron, but you wanted to have a barrel which could be rusty, imagine if you had a first-person shooter, and you don't want every barrel to be looking the same. Instead of creating 15 different barrels, you could just have a rust parameter, meaning that at rust 0, you're going to have a pristine, brand new barrel. But at rust 10, you're going to have the rustiest, most possibly mangled, the shittiest, fallen apart barrel, right? So how does that work? Well, you generate a substance which, basically uses the whatever chart you've created. Basically, you compiled this substance. Obviously, you can download it from Substance Live, and they have really high quality substances, and you don't really need to even touch Designer if you don't want to. And honestly, if I were you, I wouldn't bother because unlike assets such as zombies, etc., a player will not notice the same sand or the same cement, concrete, right? There's some basic materials which, first of all, need a particular amount of, a specific sRGB settings, such as if you were having let's say a dark material, such as I don't know, like like a paint, if you imagine if you wanted to paint a wall black, you would have to actually set up a minimum of 30 value of luminance when it comes to the sRGB, because otherwise it will not calculate correctly due to the nature of public based rendering. Physically based rendering. Look, fact of the matter is, there is no perfectly black or perfectly white or perfectly red or perfectly yellow or anything perfectly something body or object in existence. The maximum red, green, and blue things like 255 or the minimum, which is 0, is essentially an abstract thing. It's physically impossible, and therefore once you start calculating this with a physically based lighting system, you will run into errors where it's like, yeah, well, you take this, but like, how is that possible? Look, we're going to talk about this later, and I definitely will most likely go through the substance Substance Academy, Algorithmic Academy, whatever it is, where they have very nice pictures, and I will highly recommend you 2 sets of books, which not books but like PDF documents from theirs, which was written by Wes, and it does a tremendously good job at explaining what PBR is, how it works, how light is calculated, how metals are represented, paint, etc. Because it's important to understand, if you're gonna be trying to create a physically based, believable texture, you have to understand how the computer, how the graphics card will actually be calculating this stuff, all right? So that you have some rules such as minimum and maximum for bright and dark colors. Metals need to reflect however much light, or non-metals should have like no more than 40%, between 40 and 75% reflection. Sorry, not reflection, but like, reflection. Sorry, my bad. Look, the point is that I'm going into this tangent again. Because there's a lot of stuff to talk about, and maybe I'm just not organizing this correctly. But in this case, we have our substance, we have our designer, and let's say that we know all of the correct rules in how to compile and properly handle a substance, in which case we've created an iron metal, which is iron, right, with the correct values, which have to be, which are, by the way, scientifically measured and are available online and are automatically set up in Designer. So if you have something that is iron, it will have the exact same base color as an actual iron in real life. So don't worry about that. You don't have to go hunting for realistic values because they're already punched in for you. So they're as physically accurate as it is realistically possible, which is to say very, very, very realistic. Okay, so you've compiled your substance, and now you are going to dump it into Painter, because after all, even though you have a rusty metal thing where you can dial up the rust, and this substance will automatically generate a new set of textures over here, right? So this substance will always generate a set of textures. However, the difference being that this texture could be fed either into Painter while the substance is in it. So you're painting, you could just apply the substance to the barrel, right? And then you can paint over the barrel something like, I don't know, like a toxic sign or whatever, nuclear sign or explosive, right? You could basically do whatever you want in Painter, by hand. However, substance allows you more of a high level type deal where you say, okay, I want more rust across the edges. So because you've compiled this substance in such a way where you've defined where the edges are, using, let's say, like a curvature map, or even better, like a bump map, or whatever. Like you can even use, most of the time you just use the normal map. There's plenty of maps. We're going to talk about the maps anyway. But my point is that once you have this substance, which exposes the different parameters, you can set up quite a lot of stuff. You could say, all right, so I need this barrel to be dirty but not rusty. Oh, I need this barrel to be rusty and dirty. Or I need this barrel to be a little bit rusty, there's a little bit of scratches here and there, some damage on the edges or something like that, right? If it's like in a, let's say, a heavily industrial area, I want to make this barrel look very used, and this will allow you to do that on a per barrel basis. It will allow you to instantiate and basically create these different looks for the same object at no time, right? No cost of time, which is amazing, right? By the way, you can also plug a substance. I'm just going to take this because it's obvious the designer is going to output the texture. You will actually plug this substance into Unreal. It was my bad. So once you plug this substance into Unreal, I should probably maybe color this into a particular color, such as red, because this is important. I just want to make sure that you understand that Substance and Unreal can work together, meaning that you don't have to be outputting a texture. You can just dump the substance into Unreal. It will generate the textures for you inside Unreal, and then every time you decide to do something, let's say you have a texture for a rusty barrel, but you want to get rid of it, Substance, you just dial down the parameter on Substance, and it will generate the relative texture in Unreal. And this can happen at runtime. And runtime means basically that it can happen while the game is running, which is very ridiculously powerful. Can you imagine if you, as time progresses, for example, or basically anytime you need to change the texture, let's say you have a blade and you kill someone, and as you use the blade, with every day or every in-game year or whatever, the blade just deteriorates, right? The amount of the texture deteriorates. Now, in general, a runtime compilation of textures is very computationally heavy, meaning that it will take quite a lot of time. So this is undesirable. Therefore, even though this is available to be used inside the engine at runtime, most of the time you would just create a different set of texture sets using the substance inside Unreal, depending on what you need, and then just hook them up in the materials, and using some in-game logic and coding, you will manifest this inside the game whenever it is required. In the case of a bloody blade, you wouldn't have to create the textures and generate the textures every single time somebody kills someone, right? So if you, let's say your blade gets bloody once you stab someone, and you want the blood pattern to be randomized and different every time. Now you can set this to be always different at load. Every time you load the level, you're going to have a different set of textures available to pull from and apply them to the blade, and they will never repeat themselves, which is a much better alternative than having to generate the textures on the fly, which is a slow process. Now, obviously, the player may not notice it, but you will see some texture popping in if you have enough of a lag here. Usually, a substance takes anywhere between 50 and 100 milliseconds. Even the simplest substances are about 100 milliseconds to compile. More complicated stuff like, rusty iron with loads of other, parameters, etc. It takes about half a second to computate, even more depending on computers. And, assuming that you have a good computer and you only have to compile that substance and it takes you half a second, can you imagine if you're running a whole game? Anyway, that being said, this is a very valuable tool for things such as if you have an open world and you're just placing props around. Let's say, I don't know, like a bench, right? You want to have a rusty bench, or like a deteriorated, like a rotten wooden bench, or stairs, any kind of, like, maybe rocks with mold. Look, anything that is changeable. Basically, Substance allows you to create really believable atmospheres and levels. Now, on the other hand, once you have Painter, you can paint stuff on it, and then you're going to export only the texture. So the Painter will export the texture happily, and by the way, easily. However, it cannot export, and why is this fucking red? Go on then, black. There we go. Now, Painter will export the texture happily, and you will be able to use it in Unreal, which is what we're going to be doing. We're going to be going through this route over here because we don't need the procedural power of Substance for this small project. That's number one. Number two, I really don't want to go over the designer setup because it requires about maybe 10 to 15 videos just to explain to you how this whole thing works. Now, once you get used to designer, you will have no problem getting into Unreal Engine's material setup. So maybe I will do it later down the line. I'm not sure, and I don't know. But that is not our immediate problem. And like I said, if you really want to learn about designer, which I highly recommend you do, by the way, to acquaint yourself with it, I suggest you go onto the into the algorithmic website and go into their Substance Academy, and there's all sorts of stuff, right? There's even videos like this where you can just go and just take a look at the pipeline. And in fact, Wes does a much better job than me at afterwards explaining to you how to even create UVs, why these UVs exist. Now, I'm going to go over this stuff as well with you because after all, this is its own sort of closed off series. But I feel that a lot less pressure, because if I fail to mention something, there's definitely somewhere you can go, and that is obviously on the algorithmic website. All right, so that being said, this is our little pipeline, and Jesus Christ, this took longer than I expected. Just by the pipeline anyway when we were talking about it. However, there's one little tiny problem that we did not address, and I'm just gonna give you like 10 seconds to guess what it is. Just looking at this thing, what exactly is missing in this picture? Tell me. What do you think? What do you think it is? All right, so you've got Maya, right? And maybe you've got Mudbox somewhere in behind, right? You've got your little designer and painter workflow with your bakers. You bake whatever, you export either a substance or a texture, right? You got your handmade stuff over here. Your textures are done. You import into Unreal. Happy days, right? What's missing here? Well, I'll tell you what's missing. I'm gonna collapse this for a second. There we go. I even got some clip art open. So there we go. What does that look like to you? I don't know what that looks like. This is database stack, whatever. But what I'm trying to represent here with this is our source control. Source control. Remember our version control setup here, where you got, if you fuck up something, you can just recover your old version. Well, here's the thing. There is no plugin yet for version control, especially for Perforce, for the Substance. Now, if there is, at the time of this video creation, there is none. But if while you're watching this, there is some, all the power, more power to you. But at this point, you have to ask yourself a very important question: which bits are we going to source control? Because currently, you have an input and output relationship with Unreal, right? This is your source control, and I should probably create a. Where's my other thing? Where's my other thing? There it is. So this is a two-way relationship between the Perforce, which is our source control bit, right? This is our source control. Oh, geez, version control. My bad. I'm used to source control because that's like for coding, but this is a versioning engine. This is for version control, meaning that not only for source, which is the the code itself, not only for source, but also for the compiled stuff. In other words, binary files. And believe it or not, FBXs are binary files, so it's entirely possible to do this and just have this all the way at the top and say, all right, so we're gonna feed everything into the version control. Okay, and everything is going to be managed in the version control. It's entirely possible to do the same for Substance. Okay, for the whole suite here. Now it's possible to do that, but I don't think it's necessary when it comes to especially for Substance and Painter, unless of course you experience a major, and I'm talking about like a major malfunction or something like a complete hard drive failure, right? Where you lose all your data. Really, this is a little bit overkill, at least for small projects, for the very simple reason that you don't need to back up these textures. They're generated, right? You can either generate them or you can use Painter to just re-export them if you lose the textures, which will be in the imports folder anyway. And once they're in the imports folder, which means they're in Unreal, it will automatically be versioned, right? Because it's part of the, like, obviously we're going to set this up later to have your imports folder also versioned, but that's not a problem when it comes to that. Now, in the imports folder, you're also going to have your exports from Maya, because most likely, well, it depends on obviously which way you want to go about this, but I think it's best to export stuff from Maya into the Unreal imports folder, and then just open it up from open up Painter there, have its own little Substance project file associated with it onto the side, and then work from there. Which means that at most you will lose your Substance Painter project, but you should still have the same textures after they're imported into Unreal. You're not really going to lose that much. So this extra step, because the process of setting this up is exactly the same as setting it up in Unreal. Maybe a little bit easier because they actually don't have implementations, so you might have to check out stuff manually if you want to use them. For, let's say, if you wanted to go ahead and use a particular file, right? You open it up in Painter. Well, you're gonna have to check this out, and then you can check it, or you can just check out the whole project file or the whole folder if that's the case. Work on it, and then when you're done, you just check it in and submit your changes after that, which is an entirely legitimate way of working, especially since Perforce has a plugin for Windows, which allows you to just right-click into something and you have your checkout and check-in over here into this site, which is in the Windows Explorer itself. You don't have to open up the actual P4V, for the user, and then just do it from the user from your workspace, which is great. All right, but look, that's enough about version control. I just wanted to tell you that it's an important thing to consider when you're creating your pipeline. All right, because it's very easy to obviously implement after you're a ways into your how should I say, development cycle. However, the later implement this, the more problems you might run into, such as, oh, I forgot to back up this, I forgot to back up that. But then again, any version control is better than none. However, since most of our stuff will be consolidated in Unreal, I'm fairly happy with just at least in this project, to version controlling the stuff in Unreal. In a bigger project, though, you would definitely want to version absolutely everything, especially if you're working with multiple people. Now, in this case, it's just me and probably just you. So who gives a shit, right? Whatever you do, whatever you want. You know what you've done in your Maya projects. You know what you've done in your Painter. You know your little hierarchy. You have absolutely no problem with working with yourself because it is just you. But the moment you start adding people, the moment the project grows bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and suddenly there's all this shit in front of you where you need to deal with and you need to collaborate and work with this, suddenly version control becomes your best friend, meaning that you will have to actually use that. All right, so all of this would be in a version control if you're working with your friend or with an extended set of friends, with a circle of friends, or even in a semi-professional like hobby type deal. I don't know, whatever floats your boat. Point is that you need the version control not only for the backup ability that it provides, but also for the what was the freaking word now? Not cooperation, but the other one, collaboration. There we go. For collaboration of different parties. So if you got 3 artists, you got to make damn sure that they got the same project file. That is assuming they work on the same project file, of course, and that they got the most recent version of a particular FBX file. Let's say one artist is responsible for attack animations, the other one is responsible for weapons and gear. So if one of them makes a sword, which is a particular length, and then the guy who makes the animations has this sword to work with and does a particular animation, and then the tool guy, the gear guy, creates something bigger like a samurai sword, or like I don't know, he adds a cannon or something fancy like a scythe or something, right? You need to actually either update the initial sword file or maybe add the other stuff, and which need to basically be synced with the other users. And things become even more complicated once you start multiple programmers which have to read each other's codes which, you know, it's not as easy as you might think. Actually, most of the time, especially if you're programming with someone else, you'll spend 80% of your time reading their code just to understand what they did so that you could do whatever it is you got to do. So that's why commenting is important in most cases anyway, unless of course it's just you. But even then, you need even then actually at that point you need even more commenting. We're going to talk about this when we get into the blueprints and coding, and just go into how object based programming works and what's the idea behind it. Anyway, that being said, this is the end of this whole, you know, pipeline section. Geez, my mouth is dry. There's a lot of talking. Now, I hope I didn't overload your senses with a lot of information, because we're still not done. I just wanted to show you something really quick so you can understand how this whole setup works. So I'm just gonna minimize this, and over here I'm going to create a cylinder, not unlike the last. Actually, I'm going to create a sphere. Yeah, let's create a sphere. And maybe I should have created a sphere using another axis, which would be Z. Right, this is our sphere. I'm going to move this up a little bit so that we can see, or maybe I should just hide the grid. Or should I hide the grid? Forget it. I'm just going to keep the grid. So there it is, right? We've got our sphere. Now, if we go ahead and take a look at our soft, hard edges, right? We're going to toggle our soft and hard edges. Really, we have no soft and hard edges. Okay, I'm going to toggle the damn grid. I just want to forget. I forgot which hotkey was it. Let me just go for a second here. What was it? Hotkey editor. Wonder if I just write down. Jesus Christ, come on. Grid. Oh, I don't have a hotkey. Okay, I thought I had a hotkey, so I was wondering why I couldn't turn it off by mistake, but it doesn't really matter. Okay, now, what are we looking at here? Now, if you remember correctly, last time, in the last video, I told you that if you have a UV set, any UV cut that you have must be on a hard edge. Sorry, must be on a hard edge. So, you know, very simple there. However, you don't need to have a hard edge on a UV cut. Sorry, yeah, exactly like that. Geez, I'm starting to confuse my own self. Anyway, the point is, right, that whenever you have a UV cut, you need to have a hard edge, but not vice versa. All right, meaning that we need to actually examine why is that. And what I'm going to do right now, I'm going to go into display. I'm going to pop this off. In fact, I'm going to go into polygon display over here. If I can actually get this out. And I will use the Vertex Normals if I can find them. Where are you? Oh, Vertex Normals. Now, notice that we've got our little hedgehog here, and every point here has exactly one normal, all right? Meaning that it points outwards, right? And that is exactly what it should be doing, because you can only have one normal. And that's the idea of a normal, and this should make perfect sense to you. However, in a case of a hard edge, so let's say I'm going to grab this little bastard over here, right, and I'm just going to soft select this much, and I'm simply going to move him up. This is all fine and dandy, but I've created a little bit of a problem, didn't I? Notice that I've created that. First of all, I don't have enough edges over here. I'm going to turn off my thing. And let's say I'm going to grab this, and I'm just going to slide this downwards over here. And I'm just going to scale it a little bit down. So there's a little bit of a sharper angle here. And what else am I going to do? Well, I'm going to go ahead into my multi-cut tool. I'm just going to add one over here. Now notice that we currently really have, we currently don't have much of a problem when it comes to our little setup here. However, there is an immediate problem with lighting and shading over here. Right? This looks too smooth when it has to be actually fairly sharp when it comes to the cutoff point. Maybe I want to go like so, right? And this is exactly when you need to understand that hard edges are actually fairly important. Geez, am I just going inside the geometry here, or what? What's going on here? Okay, whatever, it doesn't matter. Now, if I go ahead and take a look over here in my soft and hard edges and I go ahead and soften an edge, I'm just going to do it with this thing. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and just say the angle should be 0, and I'm going to harden this. Now, let's go ahead and take a look here at the edges. Notice that all of a sudden, we've got two normals, right? You've got normal number 1 and normal number 2. Now, what's going to happen if I just change the angle? Oh, the normals, once I go a particular threshold, they just collapse. And notice that once they collapse into one single normal, I immediately get my shading back into smooth, right? Now this angle, what this angle basically means is, what is the difference, but what must the angle be between these two surfaces, right? What is this angle here, over here? What's the minimum angle that, defines when is something sharp and when is something soft? Now in this case, this is sharp because the angle is less than, what is it, 60, whatever, 7. So apparently the angle between these two suckers is 60 something, right? And there it is. You can see the angle here. Meaning that if I do this like this, and I leave this as a soft edge, I will have a lighting problem. Whereas if I go ahead and just open it like this means that instead of having, oh yeah, there we go. I confused you guys. Every time you have a hard edge, you need, everywhere you have a hard edge, you need a UV seam, but you don't need to have a hard edge on a UV seam. Jesus Christ. I'm sorry, I always confuse this. Well, when I'm talking about it anyway. But point is, if you have a hard edge, obviously you need a UV seam because you get to exploit this little system here. And what this means is that because one vertex can only have one normal, like this, there's only one normal in this vertex, and you have obviously an anti-normal going inside, but it doesn't really matter because nobody gives a shit about the anti-normal. Only some internal calculations needed, but you as a developer don't need to give a shit about the anti-normal. And like every other vertex here has one, why is it that the hard edges have two? That is because the renderer basically, this tells the renderer, the graphics card, the driver, right? The stuff that draws shit on your monitor to essentially split this in two. Okay, this means that you need to split this in two. Basically, it really splits this sphere in half. It basically cuts this off and renders this separately from this, from the rest of this sphere. Okay, meaning that you are doubling the amount of vertices that you're going to render in terms of this one loop. So if I go ahead and take this loop and I just turn this into vertices, however many I have selected, how many? That's 20 verts, right? So in this case, if I increase the angle here and I remove these, they have a single normal, I would still have 20 verts. However, if I actually define this as a hard edge, which I am defining as now, usually, by the way, the angle is 30 degrees for a hard and a soft edge. Obviously, you can define that. In this case, if I were to pass this on to the renderer in a game, it will actually render 40 verts because you're just doubling the amount. You have one for this normal, right? One vert for this normal over here, and then one vert with a normal like this. This creates a seam, which this basically means that you create a seam there. You need to have a seam on your UV so that you don't have a problem with your map. If you have a texture here, how do you think will the texture react if you actually, let's say, slap a sticker on this? Let's say a sticker of whatever. Now the engine will, like the render will create problems for you. You will see the seam over here, or you will have artifacts or edges or just rough edges where you just don't need them. All right. So yeah, it's very important to have your hard edges on this. Now look, you don't really need to create a UV cut everywhere you have a hard edge. That is a given. However, the reason you need a UV cut, the reason you need a hard edge on the UV cut 100% because is basically this stuff. See, the renderer already does that, and you need to utilize that to your advantage. Now, obviously, this means that you'll be, every time you define a hard edge, you're doubling the amount of your, doubling the amount of the influenced, the affected vertices, and this is unavoidable. But it's also very important that you do that. So I'm not going to go further into this because I just need to take a break. My mouth is gonna die soon. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut this video for now, and we actually will experiment with this over in Substance Painter, which would be over here. There we go, Substance Painter. Obviously, I recommend you download it. Oh crap, I forgot to do. All right, look, while we at it, and before I finish this video, it's not necessary for this particular case to set up the TDR, which is our timeout recovery detection. Okay, look, might as well just do it, all right? I haven't set it up on mine anyway, so I might as well do it. Look, basically what the timeout detection recovery means is that if something happens and your computer hangs, okay, if let's say something like a program or a game sends a huge texture to your graphics driver, to your graphics card, and it basically becomes unresponsive and it cannot render it, Windows will basically terminate your driver and restart it, which will result in your screen flashing black, probably all your shortcuts stacking up into a 600 by 800 window or whatever, or just, you know, just a very base resolution, which is supported, and then, you know, restarting the driver, and you'll get back your whole screen and everything like that. So this is essentially a driver crashing, and this means that it either crashed by itself, which would be a crash due to an error, or it crashed. It didn't crash, but it was just terminated by the Windows. So what you want to do, you want to run regedit, right? You want to go into your HK local machine, go into system, go into, where was that now? Current control set, that's what you want. You want to go into control, and then control, you got to go into your, where is he? Graphics drivers. Now in the graphics drivers, you may or may not have something called a Tdr delay and a Tdr Ddi delay. Okay, these are two keys that need a particular amount of values, a particular value for them to work. So if you don't have them, add them, right? You have to add them at the root level over here. You don't add them to whatever configuration or something. Something like a TDR watch here, maybe that's, no, that's, I don't know what that is. DCI, that's got a timeout value of 7. So my guess is, did that thing tell me I got a timeout value of 7? Did it then? How much is it? I think if this is the timeout value in 7, then in my case I have to just change that. Where is it? It doesn't actually tell me how much is it. So maybe that's not the case. Okay, so whatever, like forget about this. All you need to do is go into the graphics driver, right? And the reason, by the way, you need to do this is because because Substance Painter generates textures, and texture generation, and even if you decide to render something with V-Ray, requires cycles, and these cycles take time. Meaning that if you go over the default 2 seconds, which is the default, by the way, so if your graphics driver, if your graphics card, your GPU does not respond for more than 2 hours, for more than 2 seconds, Windows is automatically going to terminate the driver and restart it, meaning that, well, you're kind of screwed. There's also such a thing called Tdi Level, by the way, which controls what kind of response Windows will have. Now, a Tdi level of 1 will first check for bugs, and then it will terminate the the driver and restart it. Tdi level 2, I think, will do nothing. Tdi level 3 will just terminate and restart, and Tdi 0 will not do anything at all. Now, I'm not sure if that's the case, but you could always just research this or Google it, whatever, on your own. But essentially what you want to do, you want to go ahead and create a new D-word 32-bit value, and you want to name it Tdr Delay, like so. And you also need to create another one called, it has to be a D word anyway. It has to be called, what was it? Tdr Ddi Delay. This stuff is, by the way, case sensitive, so I recommend you, copy this over, or you just write it the way it is. It should be. Now, these things should have values. So if I go ahead and double click this, I've got a value. Now, an important thing to remember is that while it can take both of these, hexadecimals have a different meaning than decimals, right? So if you got something like 1C, it will have a different meaning than, I think this is like 1C. Is it 16? No, wait. I don't know, could be 50. I think it's 50 or maybe 60, whatever. Point is to just put it on decimal, and then whatever value input here will obviously correspond to the your delay, how much time it should be waiting for a driver to restart. So I'm going to go ahead and put, I don't know, 30 seconds, so half a minute. Whatever, like in this case, in our case, we're not going to be having a big enough project or generating 8K textures with iron bits and like loads of particles flying through and all that shit. So we're not going to do that, and it's not going to hang most likely. But depending on your graphics card, you may actually hang. So that's why it's best to just set this up to 30. Obviously, the Tdi delay is also the same. Make sure to set this up at the decimal and just pump in whatever it is. I'll see. A 30 of hexadecimal, sorry, a 3 and 0 in hexadecimal is a 48. Actually, let's see if what if I type 1C. It's 28 in decimal. Ha! Yeah, well, this is a pretty cool converter. Let's see, what about 1F? Oh, there should be more. 31. What about, so let's give like 10. What if it's 10? Oh, sorry. If it's 9F? How much is that now? I really gotta brush up on my hexadecimal, man. It's fun stuff just to do this. Anyway, back into this. So if we go ahead and write down 30, how much is that in hexadecimal? Yeah, so you could write down 1E. I forgot what the freaking numbers are, man. What the correlation was. But you can either write down as a 1E hexadecimal or use a decimal 30, right? Whatever floats your boat. You set this up. Obviously, you need to restart after this in order to have these, to have the registry reapplied on boot, and you'll be golden. Right now, in this case, now I don't want to restart my computer yet, so we'll be doing this. I'll be talking about this in the next video when I maybe just have some water to drink. But it's important to understand that this was if you're going to take something away out of this, make sure to take away the fact that whenever you have a hard edge, you're splitting the actual geometry in half when it is rendering. Right at render time, your geometry will be split up. So if I go ahead and take, essentially this is what's going to happen, right? If I go ahead and take all these faces, and I simply extract them. Okay, that's a very weird position. Just leave them out. Just lift them, please. So if I go ahead and extract them, this is what's gonna happen. With the exception that there will be actually a hole here. Oh, there is a hole here. Is there? There should be a hole here. For some fucked up reason, this thing did not perform as I expected. I have a feeling this might be the case because... Oh, this is already extracted, is it? Yeah, it's already extracted. Fuck me. Okay, is this extracted now? It's chipped off. There it is. It's not chipped off. Okay, what if I just detach? Although this really shouldn't do much. This is not going to do what I want. Well, maybe it will. See, I'm not seeing this face. This shouldn't be happening. There should be a hole here. But whatever. What if I turn this into... where is it? Two faces. Two contained faces. Yeah, there's no way I can grab this. Look, point is that this is what you're doing. All right? And notice right now, by the way, that if I move this up, that we, again, have only one set of vertices. All right, so you got one set of vertices over here pointing upwards, and one set of vertices over here pointing, in the normal direction, the correct normal direction. And it's only one because, like I said, this is split up. And if I go ahead and reattach these suckers together, it will still have the same thing. You're going to have one pointing upwards, one pointing left, so that your calculation is actually correct. Now we're going to go into this, and I'm going to show you and explain to you. By the way, I'm gonna prove it to you that whatever, like, you basically need to have a UV cut on a hard edge. Okay, every time I have a hard edge, you need to have a UV cut. I hope I didn't mix it up together again. Because look, I basically consider them the same thing. Every time I do UVs, I just make sure I do my UVs on top of the edges, and that's it. Yeah, every time you have a hard edge, you need to have a UV cut, but you don't need to have a hard edge on a UV cut. Okay, so if you have UVs, you decide to cut on, whatever, Anyway, point is, I'll see you guys next time. Yeah, make sure to install your Substance Painter and just, set it up correctly so that we can get to work in the next video. All right, cool. Bye-bye.